The mills of Lowell, Massachusetts had been running since before sunrise on a winter morning in 1873, and the light that eventually found its way through the long rows of factory windows was thin and gray, the kind of light that reveals outlines without warmth. The air inside the weaving rooms carried cotton fiber in suspension, not visible as clouds or drifts, but present as a texture in the throat, a slight resistance with each breath drawn by the men and women who stood at the looms for 10 and 11 hours each day. Along the canal streets outside, the temperature held below freezing through most of December and January, and the unpaved lanes between the tenement blocks were surfaced with packed earth and refuse that froze overnight and softened by midday into something that yielded underfoot without being reliably solid. This was the ordinary physical world for a substantial portion of the American population during the latter half of the 19th century, a world of labor conducted in conditions that required the body to be present and functional every working day, of households sharing 2-room and 3-room apartments in buildings erected quickly and without particular consideration for ventilation or light, of water drawn from wells and rivers that no municipal authority in most parts of the country had, yet chosen to monitor or treat. The expectation built into every arrangement of work in household and commerce was that the body would continue to perform. When it did not, when illness arrived, or when injury intervened, or when the slower diminishment brought by a disease quietly present for months finally became unmistakable, the consequences reached outward from the sick person and could reshape an entire family's circumstances within weeks. The 19th century in the United States offered almost nothing in the way of institutional protection against the financial consequences of falling ill. There were no employer-provided sick days, no government payments for those unable to work, no meaningful public health infrastructure in most parts of the country, and a medical profession that was simultaneously overconfident in its methods and genuinely uncertain about the nature of disease itself. A person who fell seriously ill was, in most practical respects, facing that circumstance without any structure beneath them. The story of what that actually meant for bodies, for households, for entire communities, is both a medical history and a history of economic vulnerability as it was lived, without abstraction, across the breadth of the country. For those for whom this kind of history settles well in the quiet of the evening hours, subscribing to this channel costs nothing and helps ensure that more of this content continues to reach those who find value in it. To understand what sickness meant in 19th century America, it is necessary first to understand what medicine was, or more precisely, what it had not yet become. The science that would eventually give physicians genuine authority over infectious disease. The germ theory developed by Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany during the 1870s and 1880s had not yet arrived to reorganize American medical thinking during the earlier and middle decades of the century. The profession that existed in 1850 or 1860 was built on assumptions about the body and disease that were, in several important respects, mistaken, and whose methods could inflict as much physical damage as the conditions they were designed to address. The dominant approach to medicine in the first half of the century is referred to by historians as heroic medicine, and the name captures something essential about its underlying philosophy. Disease was understood as a dangerous excess or imbalance of vital forces within the body, and a physician's task was to intervene aggressively to reduce or counter that excess, to take decisive action against a threatening condition rather than to support the body's own processes of recovery. Benjamin Rush, the Philadelphia physician and signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was perhaps the most celebrated medical figure of the early republic, applied this philosophy with particular conviction during the yellow fever epidemic that devastated Philadelphia in 1793. Rush bled his patients in quantities that later observers found difficult to credit, and administered calomel in doses large enough to produce profuse salivation, which he regarded as evidence that the body was successfully purging its dangerous imbalance. He believed and wrote explicitly that the lancet was among the most powerful instruments that Providence had placed in the hands of physician. Calomel, mercury chloride, remained in widespread use well into the second half of the century, and its effects on patients who received it at the doses then considered appropriate were significant and lasting. Mercury poisoning at that level produced excessive salivation, loosening and loss of the teeth, and in severe cases a necrosis of the jaw, a condition in which the bone itself began to deteriorate from within. Alongside calomel, physicians prescribed tartar emetic to induce vomiting, jalap and castor oil as purgatives, and opium to quiet the distress that the other remedies had generated, with the result that a patient who began treatment for a fever sometimes emerged from the experience diminished in ways entirely unrelated to the original illness. Jacob Bigelow, the Boston physician who addressed the Massachusetts Medical Society in 1835, introduced the concept of self-limited disease, the observation that many illnesses would resolve without intervention, following a natural course that treatment could neither shorten nor significantly alter. But this was not a position that found ready acceptance in a profession whose commercial structure rewarded active treatment and whose self-image rested on the conviction that the physician's presence made a decisive difference. The application of heroic medicine to the specific diseases of the era illustrates the degree to which treatment could be as dangerous as the illness itself. Pneumonia, one of the century's most common and lethal conditions, was addressed in the 1830s and 1840s with aggressive bloodletting, emetics, and the application of blistering agents to the surface of the chest wall, under the theory that the inflammation of the lung required an equal counter-irritation produced elsewhere in the body. Typhoid fever, which ran its course over 3 to 5 weeks and killed a significant proportion of those it afflicted, was subjected through much of the century to treatments directed at the fever as a symptom: cold baths, aggressive purgation, various attempts to bring the temperature down, without any understanding that the fever was a manifestation of bacterial infection deep in the intestinal wall rather than the disease in its essential character. Cholera, with its catastrophic fluid loss through unrelenting vomiting and diarrhea, was met in the early outbreaks of the century with calomel and with opium to reduce intestinal movement, both of which compounded the dehydration without addressing it. The physiological understanding that would have made fluid replacement thinkable as a primary intervention simply had not yet been constructed. By the middle decades of the century, a sustained reaction against heroic medicine had taken shape, arriving from several directions simultaneously. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who held the position of Parkman Professor of Anatomy at Harvard Medical School and was among the most widely read literary figures in the country, addressed his professional colleagues in 1860 with a directness that surprised them, arguing that if the entire stock of medicines then in common use could be thrown into the sea, the result would be considerably better for mankind and considerably worse for the fish. Holmes was a respected physician, not a polemicist, and his view carried weight precisely because it came from inside the profession rather than from any external critic. The homeopathic movement, founded in Germany by Samuel Christian Friedrich Hahnemann and established in the United States by the 1830s and 1840s, drew substantial appeal from the same dissatisfaction with regular medicine that Holmes was giving public voice to. Homeopathic practitioners administered preparations so highly diluted that they were unlikely to contain any measurable quantity of the original substance, and their patients were consequently spared the side effect of calomel and tartar emetic and blistering agents. Whatever the source of whatever benefit patients derived, homeopathic patients tended to survive their illnesses at rates at least comparable to those treated by regular physicians, a fact that contemporaries observed and that strengthened the movement considerably. By 1860, there were estimated to be approximately 2,500 homeopathic physicians practicing in the United States, along with a network of homeopathic hospitals and medical colleges that competed directly with the institutions of regular medicine. Eclecticism, centered largely at the Eclectic Medical College of Cincinnati, favored botanical preparations derived from North American plants and explicitly rejected the mineral drugs of the Orthodox school. The Thompsonian movement, following the teachings of Samuel Thompson of New Hampshire, went further still, advocating a system of botanical healing that its proponents believed any literate person could learn from a published text without the necessity of engaging a trained physician at all. These competing traditions were not simply disagreements conducted in medical journals between educated men. They were a functioning market for medical services in which patients exercised real choices shaped by cost, by cultural background, by religious affinity, and by the basic calculation of which approach had most recently helped or harmed someone within their own acquaintance. That market was possible because the legal framework governing medical practice was, through most of the century, essentially permissive. Most states had abandoned earlier licensing requirements for physicians by the 1830s and 1840s, under the influence of a Jacksonian political culture that regarded professional licensing as an aristocratic constraint on individual liberty and on free commercial competition. The result was that any person could present themselves as a physician, open an office, print a professional card, and begin charging fees without holding any credential that anyone was legally empowered to require of them. The American Medical Association, founded in 1847 in Philadelphia through the efforts of, among others, the New York physician Nathan Smith Davis, listed the reform of the situation among its primary stated goals from its earliest meetings. For its first several decades, however, it lacked both the legal authority and the institutional leverage to accomplish much in practical terms, and the medical marketplace remained substantially open to all who wished to enter it. The schools that were supposed to prepare practitioners for this open market had, by mid-century, multiplied rapidly in number while declining in average quality. By 1850, there were approximately 42 medical schools operating in the United States, and by the late 1870s, that figure had grown to nearly 100. The great majority were proprietary institutions, owned by small groups of faculty members who collected tuition directly, employed themselves as lecturers, and had a direct financial interest in graduating as many students as their facilities could hold. Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia and the College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York offered genuine clinical instruction, but the typical proprietary school required attendance at 2 sessions of 4 to 5 months each, delivered substantially the same lectures in both years, imposed no meaningful entrance requirements, provided no laboratory instruction of any kind, and conducted final examinations that were understood by all involved to be procedural in character. A graduate who held a diploma of one of these institutions was, in the eyes of the law in most states, the legal equivalent of a graduate of Harvard or of any other institution. However distinguished, and most patients seeking medical attention had no reliable means of distinguishing between them. The practical consequences of this arrangement were felt most directly by those who lived at the greatest distance from any trained practitioner. In rural counties of states like Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia, the nearest physician of any description might require a journey of 20 or 30 miles over roads that in winter were barely passable, and in many such communities effective medical authority resided largely with experienced women, mothers, grandmothers, and neighbors who had accumulated through years of nursing sick household members a practical knowledge of herbal preparations and domestic nursing that was transmitted through family and community networks rather than through any institution. This domestic medical tradition was the primary healthcare resource for millions of Americans throughout the century, and it carried a considerable advantage of requiring no payment in money and no journey over uncertain terrain to obtain. The immigrant communities concentrated in the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest had in many cases carried medical traditions from their countries of origin that persisted as real alternatives alongside the official market. German immigrant neighborhoods in Cincinnati and St. Louis supported physicians trained in German university clinics, whose methods had in some respects been shaped by a clinical and laboratory tradition more rigorous than what many American proprietary schools were producing. Irish communities in Boston and New York often relied first on remedies and practices carried from the west of Ireland, administered by women who held genuine authority within their communities on questions of health and illness. Italian and Polish immigrants arriving in the latter decades of the century brought comparable traditions, and the ethnic neighborhoods of the industrial city consequently contained, by the 1880s and 1890s, a dense and complex layering of formal and informal medical practice that official directories of licensed physicians never reflected, and that official statistics never attempted to measure. Between the formal physician and the household remedy, the apothecary or druggist occupied an intermediate position that was, for working-class families, often the most practically accessible point of medical contact. The druggist stocked and dispensed both prescribed and proprietary medicines, but in practice also functioned as an informal advisor, recommending preparations and dosages to customers who came to him before committing to the expense of physician's visit, or who came afterward and could not follow through on physician's recommendations because the cost was beyond what the household could absorb. In the immigrant neighborhoods of the industrial city, the druggist who spoke the same language as his customers and understood the remedies they had been accustomed to in their countries of origin occupied a position of considerable practical trust and influence. The absence of any regulatory framework governing this advisory role meant that the quality of what was dispensed across a pharmacy counter varied enormously, with no mechanism available to the customer for distinguishing between the useful and the harmful. Among the most widely used remedies in both professional and domestic practice was laudanum, a preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol that was available without prescription at any pharmacy throughout the century. Laudanum was administered to adults for pain, for persistent cough, for diarrhea, for insomnia, and for the general category of distress that resisted other treatment. And it was given to children as well in preparations marketed specifically for that purpose. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, sold as a teething remedy for infants and advertised widely through the latter half of the century, contained approximately 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce. The addictive properties of opiate preparations were not unknown to the medical community, but the alternatives for pain management in an era without aspirin or any modern analgesic were genuinely limited, and the medical literature of the period reflects a recurring tension between awareness of opium's long-term consequences and the simple reality that it provided, for the immediate relief of suffering, the most effective agent available. The patent medicine trade operated at a scale that placed it well beyond the commercial reach of the entire regular medical profession combined, and it did so without any obligation to demonstrate efficacy or disclose what its preparations contained. The Kickapoo Indian Medicine Company, operating out of New Haven, Connecticut, employed performers who traveled in painted wagons from settlement to settlement across the country, staging theatrical entertainments before which their preparations were sold to audiences assembled as much by the spectacle as by any medical need. Lydia Estes Pinkham's vegetable compound, introduced in Lynn, Massachusetts in 1875 and marketed with a campaign that placed Pinkham's own portrait and a personal invitation to write to her directly on every bottle, became one of the most commercially successful proprietary preparations in American history, sold specifically to women for conditions the advertising described as female complaints. The compound contained approximately 18 parts alcohol per 100 parts by volume, a proportion similar to that of fortified wine, a fact nowhere disclosed on a label and not advertised by the company. The federal government imposed no obligation on any manufacturer to list ingredients, substantiate therapeutic claims, or disclose the presence of alcohol or opiates in any preparation, and that regulatory absence would not be corrected until the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. The medical profession was, in this period, almost entirely male, not through formal legal prohibition in most states, but through the near-universal practice of established medical schools declining to admit women students. Elizabeth Blackwell, who received her degree from Geneva Medical College in Western New York in 1849, became the first woman to hold a medical degree in the United States, and the path she established remained narrow for many years. The Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, founded in 1850 in Philadelphia, provided one of the few formal routes to medical training available to women, and its graduates entered a profession that remained substantially resistant to their presence regardless of their qualifications or competence. The essential work of women in medicine during this period, through formal training at institutions like the Women's Medical College, through domestic nursing, through the continuing and significant role of the midwife in communities where obstetric care by male physicians was either culturally unwelcome or financially inaccessible, was indispensable to the actual functioning of American healthcare, while remaining almost entirely absent from the official history the profession wrote about. Itself, the patient who managed to consult a formally trained physician encountered, even then, a diagnostic process whose possibilities were substantially narrower than those available even a generation later. The clinical thermometer, whose diagnostic value Carl Wunderlich's 1868 monograph on body temperature had established in systematic terms, was becoming common in physicians' bags by the 1870s, though its use was not yet universal. The stethoscope, invented by the French physician René Laennec in 1816, and refined over the following decades, had become standard in physical examination by mid-century. Beyond these instruments, the physician assessed the pulse and its qualities, its rate, its strength, its regularity, observed the skin for pallor or flushing or jaundice, listened to the chest, examined the urine, and inquired into the history and pattern of symptoms, assembling a diagnosis entirely from clinical inference without any laboratory tests to confirm or refine it. The bacterial cause of tuberculosis was not identified until Robert Koch announced his findings in Berlin in 1882, and the bacterial causes of typhoid and cholera followed within a few years of that. Before those identifications, a physician who told his patient that the illness appeared likely to be consumption was offering a clinical judgment that experience had made him capable of forming, but that no investigation available to him could either confirm or refute. What the physician offered in exchange for his fee was judgment, experience, and the application of whatever the current state of knowledge endorsed. And this was, In every instance, a private commercial transaction between two individuals, with no institution bearing any portion of the cost. A consultation in a mid-sized American city in the 1870s cost between $1 and $2 for an office visit, and between $2 and $3 for a home visit. A male factory worker in the textile mills of New England in the same period earned between $6 and $8 for a full week of labor. A woman doing equivalent work in the same mills earned between $3 and $5 for the same hours. A serious illness requiring physician attendance over 10 days or 2 weeks. The approximate duration of a typical fever illness in a patient who survived it could accumulate $15 to $25 in physician fees alone, a sum representing several weeks of careful saving for most working-class households, arriving at the precise moment when the household income had already ceased because the sick person could no longer go to work. That arithmetic, income stopped, costs mounting without interruption, was a specific mechanism through which illness translated, with a regularity that most people of the period regarded as simply the order of things, into a financial crisis from which recovery could take years, and from which some households never recover at all. The financial arithmetic of illness in 19th century America followed a sequence so consistent that those who worked with the poor in this era came to recognize it almost as reliably as the courses of the diseases themselves. It began, in nearly every case, with the loss of wages. In a household economy built entirely on earned income, with no employer providing compensation for days not worked and no government agency prepared to substitute for lost earnings, the cessation of wages on a first day of incapacity was not a future financial difficulty to be negotiated over time, but an immediate and concrete event, a specific absence at the end of the first week, when the payment that had covered the rent and purchased the food and maintained the narrow margin of current. Solvency simply did not appear. Carol D. Wright, who became the first commissioner of the Massachusetts Bureau of Statistics of Labor in 1873 and conducted some of the most thorough investigations into working-class household conditions of the century, found through his surveys of textile operatives, shoe factory workers, and building tradesmen that the great majority of households in his sample maintained savings of less than $50 at any given time, and that a substantial proportion held no savings at all. This was not, as it was frequently characterized by contemporary moralists and charitable administrators, evidence of improvidence or poor financial management. It was a direct and predictable result of wage levels that, in the best of employment conditions, left only enough margin after necessities to build savings at the rate of a few dollars per month, if that, and that during the periods of winter slowdown or mill shutdowns that were a regular feature of the industrial economy, left no margin at all. When a textile worker in the Merrimack Valley fell ill with typhoid fever in the late summer, which was a characteristic season for its appearance, since the disease traveled through water contaminated with human waste during the warmer months, the 3 to 5 weeks required for the illness to run its course represented a loss of between $18 and $40 in wages, depending on the worker's rate of pay and the practices of a particular employer regarding compensation during incapacity, which most employers did not provide. Against this loss of income, the household faced costs that arrived simultaneously and could not be deferred. Physician attendance of between $2 and $3 per house visit during the acute phase of the illness, the purchase of preparations a physician recommended, and in some cases the engagement of assistants for nursing the patient through periods when other household members were required to be at work in order to prevent a complete cessation of the household's income. A serious illness of 4 weeks' duration could accumulate expenses equal to 2 full months of careful saving, arriving at the precise moment when the source of that saving had stopped entirely. The disease that most consistently demonstrated the capacity of illness to produce a thorough and extended financial ruin was tuberculosis, known in this era almost universally as consumption, a name that described with some accuracy the way the disease reduced its sufferer over months and years rather than days. A person developing consumption in the 1860s or 1870s faced an illness that medicine could address symptomatically but not arrest, that required rest at precisely the time when rest meant the complete cessation of income, and that in its later stages demanded the sustained nursing presence of a second adult member of the household, effectively removing 2 people from productive labor, where only one was clinically ill. The physician Edward Livingston Trudeau, who was himself diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1873 and would later establish the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium at Saranac Lake, New York, in 1884, observed from direct personal experience that the prescription of rest and fresh country air, which represented the best that medicine could offer a person with this disease, was available in practice only to those with the financial resources to follow it, since a laborer who rested was a laborer whose family could not eat. The position of women in a household with a male primary earner fell ill was defined by a double burden that the household economy imposed without formally acknowledging. The wife who had previously managed the domestic labor of the household became simultaneously a nurse to the sick person and, in many cases, someone required to generate additional income through taking and washing, completing piecework for a local factory, or seeking a position at the factory gate. All at a moment when her own health was frequently compromised by sheer exposure to whatever illness had struck the husband. Carol Wright's labor surveys documented numerous household cases in which the wife's health had declined either simultaneously with or shortly after the husband's, producing what the survey language of the period described simply as a case of destitution. 2 incapacitated adults in a household with dependent children and no remaining income of any kind. Among the coping strategies most commonly employed by households attempting to manage the cost of a member's illness was the taking in of boarders, accepting 1 or 2 single working men in exchange for a room, and sometimes meals, which added a few dollars per week to the household's income and allowed rent payments to continue when earned wages alone could no longer sustain them. This arrangement required the wife to perform additional cooking and washing for the boarders alongside her ordinary domestic work and whatever nursing the patient required, at a moment when she was already operating at the limits of her available energy. Settlement house workers who surveyed households in the tenement districts of New York, Chicago, and Boston in the 1880s and 1890s documented the boarder arrangement as one of the most common visible indicators of a household under financial stress, and noted in a significant proportion of their case records that the stress in question could be traced through careful inquiry to a recent illness and its unresolved costs. The New York Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, which had conducted organized charitable work among the city's poor since its founding in 1843, documented in its annual reports a pattern its caseworkers encountered with such regularity that they recorded it almost as routine. The family that had maintained itself on earned wages for some years, avoiding charitable assistance and preserving its own household's independence, presenting at the association's offices in a condition of acute need precipitated by the illness of one member. The association's visitors described finding these families at various stages along a recognizable trajectory: savings exhausted, possessions sold or pledged against loans, rent in arrears, the landlord presenting demands that could not be satisfied, and no source of further assistance remaining except the association itself. The sequence of asset liquidation that preceded a formal request for charitable help followed a logic that the working poor understood from direct observation of neighbors who had preceded them along it, and in many cases from having followed portions of it in earlier periods of hardship. Savings were exhausted first. Then came the small stores of household goods that could be converted to cash at the pawnbroker, clothing reserved for church attendance, a watch that had marked some passage of working life, modest ornamental objects representing the accumulated domestic ambitions of a family that had saved for them deliberately. Lillian Wald, who established the Henry Street settlement on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1893, noted in her case records the regularity with which these objects appeared at neighborhood pawn shops in the weeks following the onset of a family member's serious illness, and noted with equal regularity that they did not return, since the combination of the pawnbrokers' accumulated interest and the continued drain of medical and living expenses during the period of incapacity made redemption a financial achievement that most households in this situation did not reach. After the pawnbroker came approaches to neighbors and relatives for loans framed as temporary obligations, though all parties understood that a household depleted by weeks of illness had no near-term path to repayment. After those sources were exhausted, an application to a formal charitable organization became the only remaining option short of complete destitution, and many families delayed that step as long as possible, since seeking charitable assistance carried social consequences in neighborhoods where it was observed and where the memory of it persisted. Charles Loring Brace, who founded the Children's Aid Society in New York in 1853 and spent decades observing the city's poorest districts, wrote in his 1872 study of the dangerous classes of New York that among the children living without stable homes in the streets and lodging houses of Lower Manhattan, a substantial proportion could trace their circumstances to the illness or death of a parent, after which the surviving adult had been unable to maintain the household on a single income. Brace's observations were drawn from New York specifically, but the pattern he described repeated itself in every industrial city in the country, wherever wages were calibrated to sustain a household under ordinary conditions and left nothing in reserve for the condition that a serious illness reliably produced. In the mining communities of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, the financial consequences of illness were compounded by the structural arrangements specific to those industries. The practice of paying miners in company scrip, redeemable only at company-owned stores, common in many coal-producing regions through the middle decades of the century, placed miners in dependence on their employers that was difficult to exit in ordinary circumstances and nearly impossible to manage during a period of incapacity. A miner who fell ill was simultaneously a debtor to the company store, a tenant in company housing, and a worker with no formal claim on any compensation for his illness, facing potential loss of his housing if his incapacity extended beyond whatever period his employer chose to accommodate. The operations of the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company in the anthracite districts of northeastern Pennsylvania and the Cambria Iron Works near Johnstown maintained precisely the kind of compound employer dependencies that ensured a sick worker was also, almost immediately, a worker with diminishing ground beneath him. For agricultural workers, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and hired laborers, the geometry of vulnerability had its own particular character. The tenant farmer in the South, operating under a crop lien arrangement, entered each agricultural year already indebted to a landlord or merchant who had advanced credit for seeds and supplies against the future harvest, with interest attached. A serious illness during planting or harvesting could produce an insufficient crop that failed to satisfy the lien, carrying the debt forward into the following year with compound effect. For freedmen farming on shares in the former Confederate states, illness arrived within an already constructed framework of legal and economic constraint that offered almost no leverage for self-extraction. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, operating between 1865 and 1872, had established a network of hospitals in the former Confederate states that represented, for several years, nearly the only formal medical infrastructure available to freedmen across large portions of the South. At its height in 1867, the Bureau operated approximately 40 hospitals and provided medical care to more than 400,000 patients annually. When Congress dismantled the Bureau in 1872, that infrastructure was not replaced by any state or local apparatus, and the freedmen's exposure to financial consequences of illness returned to conditions that, in many counties, exceeded the vulnerability experienced by the industrial poor of the northern cities, since the northern poor at least had access to immigrant community organizations and fraternal mutual aid societies prepared to provide some assistance when their members fell ill. Robert Hunter, whose study of poverty published in 1904 drew on 2 decades of case records accumulated by charitable organizations across the country, estimated that approximately 10 million persons in the United States were living in conditions of genuine poverty, and that among the most commonly cited precipitating causes, illness of the person presenting or of a family member whose incapacity had cascaded outward across the household economy, ranked among the 3 most significant. Hunter noted with some care that illness as a recorded cause of poverty was almost certainly an undercount, since charitable visitors often recorded the presenting condition rather than its antecedent, and what appeared in case files as loss of employment frequently had its origin in a period of illness that had first cost a worker weeks of wages, and then cost his position entirely when the employer filled it during his absence. The seasonal rhythm of illness in this era compounded these financial consequences in ways that rarely appeared in policy discussions. Summer and early autumn brought the highest incidence of typhoid, cholera in epidemic years, and the intestinal illnesses that killed infants and young children in urban tenements at rates that seasonal mortality statistics recorded with quiet consistency. This was also, for many industries, the period of lower demand and reduced employment. The slow season in the textile mills, the gap between construction contracts in the building trades. A worker who fell ill in August or September therefore faced a diminishment of illness arriving precisely when his earnings were already reduced by the seasonal contraction of his industry, leaving him with less financial capacity to absorb medical costs at the moment those costs were most likely to appear. The almshouse, known variously as the poorhouse or the county farm depending on local custom, stood at the far end of this sequence of deterioration as the institution that received those for whom every preceding resource had been exhausted. Almshouses operated in nearly every county of the northern states by mid-century, maintained at public expense on the principle, firmly held by most of their superintendents and political overseers, that public assistance should impose enough discomfort to prevent any reasonable preference for it over the labor market. The Kings County Almshouse in Flatbush, Brooklyn, received several thousand residents annually through the 1860s and 1870s, housing the chronically ill, the elderly without family support, and those whose financial collapse had arrived rapidly enough to leave them without resources for any alternative. The common features of these institutions, communal dormitories, minimal provision, the mixing of residents whose circumstances range across every misfortune that the century could produce, made the almshouse a destination that the working poor regarded, with considerable accuracy, as one for which return to prior self-sufficiency was rare. Josephine Shaw Lowell, who founded the New York Charity Organization Society in 1882, and whose influence on charitable policy in New York State extended to the final decade of the century, argued in her published reports that the almshouse system failed to distinguish between those reduced to poverty by illness, who she believed deserved a different and more constructive response, and those whose circumstances she attributed to other causes. The State Charities Aid Association of New York, organized in 1872 under the active involvement of Louisa Lee Schuyler, had argued that outdoor relief, assistance provided to the poor in their own homes, created dependency and should be eliminated in favor of institutional care, a position that New York City effectively acted upon in 1874, and that Brooklyn followed in 1878. The practical effect on households whose poverty had originated in illness was that a starker choice now confronted them: enter the almshouse or manage without public assistance at all. What is most revealing about these debates, and what the historical record preserves with some clarity, is that the question under discussion was never whether the economic structure that made illness financially ruinous might itself require examination. The question was always how to manage the consequences of that structure more efficiently, how to sort the deserving from the undeserving, how to provide the minimum that decency required without providing so much that the incentive to avoid dependence was diminished. The assumption that illness was a financial responsibility of the person who suffered it, to be met on whatever private resources could be assembled and supplemented only at the point of total failure by the reluctant minimum of public provision, was not in this period a contested claim. It was a premise so widely shared that it organized even its critics' arguments. The water in which the entire discussion took place, visible only from outside a frame that almost no one in this era had yet acquired a language to name. The word hospital, in the vocabulary of most Americans through the middle and later decades of the 19th century, did not carry the connotations of therapeutic possibility that would gradually accrue to it across the following century. It described instead a specific kind of institution serving a specific kind of person, and those who lived in the neighborhoods closest to its wards and who would watch what happened to neighbors and family members who entered its doors held views about it that were largely unsentimentalized and sometimes explicitly fearful. To enter a hospital in this era was not a decision taken, because hospital care was understood to offer advantages over care at home. It was a decision taken, or more often a circumstance arrived at, when everything that might have sustained a person through an illness at home, the income, the household support, the family members with the time and capacity to nurse, had already been exhausted, and the only remaining question was what institution would accept responsibility for a person who could no longer maintain any other arrangement. The middle and upper classes in 19th century America were treated at home. This was not simply a preference or a cultural habit, but a rational assessment of the relative risks involved, since the evidence available at the time, to anyone who chose to look at it, suggested that the hospital was among the most dangerous environments a seriously ill or injured person could enter. James Young Simpson, the Edinburgh obstetrician whose work on chloroform had already earned him a significant place in the history of medicine, coined the term hospitalism in 1869 to describe a phenomenon that practitioners on both sides of the Atlantic had observed without yet systematizing, that patients who underwent major surgery in a hospital died of subsequent infection at rates far exceeding those who underwent equivalent procedures in private homes or small cottage establishments. And at the larger and more celebrated the hospital, the worse its aggregate mortality from what was then called surgical fever tended to be. Simpson calculated that a patient who lost a limb to amputation in a major urban hospital in Britain faced a probability of death from infection approaching 1 in 2, while a patient who underwent the same operation in a rural cottage practice faced a considerably lower risk. His figures were contested in their specific magnitudes, but were not overturned in their general direction. And the phenomenon he named was real enough that serious practitioners acknowledged it while disagreeing vigorously about its explanation. The explanation would not be fully secured until germ theory provided a conceptual framework within which the evidence became interpretable. But even before that framework arrived, certain observational facts were clear enough. Wounds dressed in a hospital environment frequently developed a condition then called hospital gangrene, in which the tissue around a wound turned dark, emitted a characteristic odor, and spread in a manner that proved fatal in a high proportion of cases. The surgical wards of Bellevue Hospital in New York City, which have been operating on its site on the East River at 26th Street since the early decades of the century, and which received the largest single volume of charity patients in the northeastern United States, recorded surgical mortality rates that reflected the general pattern Simpson had described. Joseph Lister's antiseptic surgical method, introduced in Glasgow in 1867, and demonstrated through published results that reduced post-operative infection rates substantially, was received with interest but also with resistance in the American medical community through the 1870s, partly on grounds of the inconvenience of carbolic acid spray in the operating environment, and partly because the germ theory on which Lister's method was explicitly premised had not yet achieved the authority in American medicine that it would carry after Robert Koch's work of the early 1880s made it essentially unanswerable. The practical result of this delay was that patients admitted to American hospital surgical wards continued to face infection risks at a level that the American medical profession could observe in its own records for a decade after a demonstrably effective remedy had been published, and that the profession could have, had it chosen with greater urgency, adopted. Bellevue Hospital was the largest and most complex public medical institution in the country by the 1870s, and it was also, in significant respects, a representative example of what a charity hospital was and how it functioned. The institution had evolved from the 6 Milestone establishment, a small workhouse and infirmary that the city of New York had maintained outside the city limits in the early years of the century, had grown through decades of expansion driven by the growth of the city's population and the consequent growth of the class of persons who arrived at its gates in need of care. By 1870, the hospital received more than 15,000 patients annually across its wards, which included a medical department, a surgical department, an obstetric ward, an insane pavilion, and a children's ward, all housed in a complex of brick buildings that had expanded incrementally without the benefit of any comprehensive architectural plan. The patients who filled these wards came from the waterfront boarding houses and the immigrant tenements of the lower wards of Manhattan, from the police courts and the missions, from the construction sites where Irish and German laborers suffered falls and crushings that left them unable to survive unassisted, and from the ships whose crews arrived at the port of New York carrying the fevers that the vessel had encountered in its passage. The nurses who attended these patients through most of the century's middle decades had received no formal training of any description. Before the establishment of organized nursing schools in the 1870s, hospital nursing was performed largely by working-class women whose qualification for the role consisted primarily in their willingness to accept the modest compensation offered and their capacity to perform the physical labor involved, the washing, the feeding, the changing of dressings, the management of bedpans, the sitting through the night watches that were among the most demanding aspects of the work. The standard of care these women provided varied enormously from individual to individual, and the conditions under which they worked, the overcrowded wards, the absence of protective clothing or any understanding of contagion, the physical demands of 12-hour shifts on their own health, ensured a rate of turnover that made the accumulation of practical competence across a ward difficult to sustain. Dickens had satirized this type of nurse in the character of Cyril Gamp in his 1843 novel Martin Chuzzlewit, And while the satiric exaggeration served Dickens's comic purposes, it drew on a recognizable social reality that his readers had no difficulty placing. Florence Nightingale's transformation of military nursing during the Crimean War, and her subsequent statistical work demonstrating that the application of sanitary principles to hospital conditions could reduce mortality rates substantially, exercised an influence on American thinking about hospital nursing that was genuine, but slow in its practical effects. Dorothea Dix, who served as superintendent of Army nurses during the Civil War between 1861 and 1865, and recruited more than 3,000 women to serve in Union military hospitals, demonstrated that organized, disciplined nursing could be conducted at significant scale under difficult conditions, and the Civil War nursing experience produced a generation of women whose practical competence and sense of professional purpose had no formal institutional home once. The war ended. The first formal nursing training schools in the United States were established in 1873 at the New Haven Hospital in Connecticut through the Connecticut Training School, at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston through the Boston Training School, and at Bellevue Hospital itself through the Bellevue Training School, all three organized in explicit response to Nightingale's published model of nursing education. Linda Richards, who graduated from the New England Hospital for Women and Children in Boston in 1873 and is generally recognized as the first formally trained nurse in the United States, began practicing in an environment that remained for many years isolated in its professional commitments from the broader hospital world, in which most nursing continued without formal training of any kind. The gradual improvement in nursing practice that these schools represented proceeded unevenly through the following decades, constrained in its pace by the cost of trained nurses relative to untrained ones, by the resistance of some physicians to any increase in nursing authority that might appear to encroach upon medical prerogatives, and by the simple scale of the problem in institutions like Bellevue or the Philadelphia Hospital at Blockley, where the patient volumes were sufficient to require nursing labor that training schools could not yet supply. The Philadelphia Hospital at Blockley, the municipal almshouse and hospital complex in West Philadelphia, housed at various points in its history between 1,500 and 3,000 residents, including the destitute ill, the chronically insane, the elderly indigent, and acutely sick patients who had been admitted because they had nowhere else to go, all managed by a staff whose resources were calibrated not to what adequate care might require, but to what the city's appropriation process chose to provide. The experience of being a patient in these institutions carried dimensions that extended beyond the physical conditions of the ward itself. The sick person who entered a charity hospital entered a relationship with the institution that bore little resemblance to the relationship between a private physician and a paying patient. And the nature of that difference was most precisely embodied in the practice of clinical teaching that the charity hospital made possible. The recognition that hospital patients provided the clinical material through which the next generation of physicians could be educated was embedded in the founding rationale of American medical education from its earliest decades. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Bond, who established the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia in 1751, the first hospital in the colonies, had argued explicitly that the hospital would provide clinical instruction to medical students in ways that private practice could not. And the arrangement that followed from this argument was straightforward in its logic and uncomfortable in its social implications. Patients who could not pay for their care would receive that care at no monetary cost, and in exchange they would submit to examination, demonstration, and observation by groups of students learning the clinical skills they would apply for fees throughout their subsequent careers. This arrangement was so thoroughly normalized that it generated almost no public controversy through most of the century, and the silence around it reflected the degree to which the purse of the poor patient was not regarded in public discourse as a holder claims that the medical institution was obliged to weigh against its educational objectives. A middle-class family member ill at home was attended by a single physician, visited at times of the physician's choosing, examined privately and without audience, and treated with a degree of personal consideration that the clinical encounter between two contracting parties tends to generate regardless of the medical knowledge available. The charity ward patient in the same decade was examined by the ward physician in the presence of whatever number of students happened to be assigned to the service that week, was discussing clinical terms while present in the room, was the subject of teaching demonstrations in which the physical findings of the illness were pointed out and analyzed as evidence of the condition's natural history. and had no formal mechanism available to decline this role, since declining it would have meant declining the care itself, which for a patient who had arrived at a charity ward was not in most cases a meaningful option. The racial dimensions of hospital access and hospital experience in this period were both consistent in their pattern and varied in their specific expression depending on the region of the country. In the former Confederate states, the destruction of the Freedmen's Bureau medical infrastructure in 1872 had left black Southerners in a situation of acute medical vulnerability. Most white-operated hospitals in the South refused to admit black patients to any but segregated facilities with inferior conditions, when they admitted them at all. The few hospitals established specifically to serve black communities, among them the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, established in 1863 on the grounds of Howard University and providing the primary site of medical training for black physicians through much of the latter part of the century, served far more patients than their resources could adequately support and operated against the persistent pressure of congressional appropriations that reflected the political value Congress assigned to their mission. In the northern cities, the exclusions were less formal but no less real in their effects. Bellevue and the larger municipal hospitals of New York did admit black patients to their charity wards, but the black population of the city was disproportionately concentrated in the neighborhoods of worse sanitary conditions. The waterfront districts, the tenement blocks of the 6th Ward, and later the Tenderloin and San Juan Hill neighborhoods, and had access to fewer of the informal support structures that could help a working family manage the early stages of an illness before it reached the point requiring hospitalization. The mortality differentials that these conditions produced were recorded in New York City vital statistics that public health reformers cited through the 1880s and 1890s. But the structural explanation for those differentials, that the distribution of the social cost of illness was not uniform across the population, but was concentrated along the lines of race and poverty, required a kind of analysis that the public health vocabulary of the period was only beginning to develop. The physical plan of the hospital itself embodied assumptions about the relative value of its patients that any careful observer of the buildings could read directly. The private rooms in those few institutions that maintained them, and the semi-private wards where fee-paying patients could be placed at some distance from the largest charity wards, were physically separated from the main hospital building in some institutions and finished to standards of interior construction and furnishing that made the contrast with the open charity wards, with their rows of iron-frame beds at close intervals and their communal facilities, entirely visible to any patient, moving between the two environments. The New York Hospital on Broadway, which had operated since its founding charter in 1771 and maintained a mixed patient population of paying and charity cases, made this architectural distinction with a clarity that reflected the institution's dual character as both a philanthropic establishment and a commercial enterprise maintaining the custom of those with the means to pay. The transformation of the hospital's identity that gathered pace in the final 15 years of the century rested on several convergent developments. The acceptance of antiseptic and then aseptic surgical technique through the 1880s reduced post-operative mortality rates in ways that were visible in institutional records and that changed the calculation a private patient with access to alternatives might make about the relative merits of hospital versus home surgery. The opening of the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in 1889, with associated nursing school modeled on the Nightingale system and its residency program that kept physicians in the hospital at all hours to provide continuity of care, established a standard against which other institutions began to measure themselves. The introduction of surgical procedures that required the equipment, the lighting, the trained surgical nursing, and the sterile instrument preparation of a purpose-designed operating room began to make hospital surgery genuinely superior to what could be achieved in a domestic setting. And this shift in the practical calculus of outcome gradually drew paying patients into hospital settings who would not previously have considered going there. This transformation was real, and its effect on the quality of care available would eventually be profound, but it arrived unevenly and it arrived late. For the majority of the century, the hospital remained what its patient population made visible, an institution whose primary function was to manage, contain, and provide the minimum decency of medical supervision to those who had been left by the failure of every private arrangement, without any other place to go. That function was not merely adjacent to the problem of poverty, as the 19th century understood it. It was built into the hospital's basic operating logic, which required the poverty of its patients in order to justify the medical education those patients provided, and which depended on the absence of private alternatives to ensure that the charity ward remained full enough to be a viable teaching environment. The hospital and the economic condition of the sick poor were not, in this era, separate phenomena that happened to intersect. They were, in a structural sense, designed for one another. The epidemic diseases of the 19th century arrived with a rhythm that those who lived through the era learned to anticipate without being able to prevent. The summer heat that preceded the cholera season in the river cities. The reports advancing northward along the Mississippi in late August of yellow fever pushing up from New Orleans. The winter crowding in the tenements that corresponded each year with the seasonal rise in deaths from consumption that vital statistics recorded within. Evenness that spoke to structural conditions rather than accidental ones. Each of these diseases was, in the most immediate sense, a biological event produced by organisms whose nature medicine did not yet understand in any systematic way through most of the century. But each epidemic was also an economic event of the first order, a concentrated and suddenly visible expression of the social costs that were otherwise distributed quietly across individual households in the years between outbreaks, made legible by the scale and speed at which an epidemic produced them all at once. The Asiatic cholera appeared in North America for first time in the summer of 1832, carried by immigrants aboard ships that had departed from Liverpool, Cork, and Hamburg, and whose passengers had contracted the disease during the Atlantic crossing before any port authority had developed the capacity to identify and hold back an outbreak effectively. New York City, whose population stood at approximately 200,000 at the time, recorded 3,515 deaths between June and October that year, with mortality concentrated heavily in the densely inhabited wards of the lower city, where Irish and German immigrants occupied the most crowded housing available. New Orleans reported approximately 6,000 deaths in the same outbreak. Montreal, where the ships had first made landfall on the North American continent, suffered proportionate losses that exceeded even those of the larger American cities. The response of the city's propertied residents to the epidemic's arrival established a pattern that every subsequent outbreak in the century would repeat without significant variation. Those with the means to leave the city did so, departing for country houses or the homes of relatives at a distance from the affected area, withdrawing from the urban environment the financial resources and personal networks that would have constituted some fraction of the city's capacity to respond. Those who remained with the poor concentrated in precisely the neighborhoods of worse sanitary condition, overcrowded housing with inadequate drainage, wells sharing ground with privies, streets where refuse accumulated without regular removal, courtyards shared among dozens of households that lacked any private sanitary facility of their own. The public health knowledge of 1832 had not yet identified the mechanism by which cholera spread, and the miasma theory, which held that disease arose from the putrid airs generated by decomposing organic matter in low-lying and poorly ventilated areas, pointed toward the correct neighborhoods without providing the correct explanation, since the disease traveled through water contaminated by human fecal matter rather than through corrupted air, a distinction that John Snow would demonstrate in London in 1854 through his investigation of the Broad Street pump outbreak in the Soho district, and that Robert Koch would confirm by identifying the Vibrio cholerae organism in the early 1880s. The 1849 epidemic returned to New York and the river cities with greater force than the first had carried, killing approximately 5,000 people in New York City and comparable or greater numbers in Cincinnati, St. Louis, and New Orleans. Cholera arrived again in 1866 in what proved to be the last major American outbreak of the century, and by that point the newly established Metropolitan Board of Health in New York City, organized in that same year under the leadership of, among others, the physician Stephen Smith, who had served as sanitary inspector for the United States Army during the Civil War, had developed sufficient organizational capacity to impose quarantine measures at the port to inspect and close the worst of the contaminated water sources in the affected wards, and to document the outbreak with a statistical precision that the earlier responses had entirely lacked. The 1866 epidemic killed fewer than 600 people in New York City, a reduction in mortality compared to the earlier outbreaks that the board's leadership attributed to its interventions, and that subsequent historians have largely confirmed as a genuine achievement of early public health administration. The economic consequences of these three cholera visitations were felt most directly in the days and weeks of commercial paralysis that accompanied each outbreak, as trade slowed or stopped, as the wealthier residents who sustained the retail economy departed, as labor-dependent businesses lost workers to illness and death simultaneously. The Board of Aldermen of New York City appropriated emergency funds for the removal of the sick to public hospital facilities during the 1832 outbreak, and these appropriations created a temporary fiscal strain that was compounded by the reduction in tax revenue produced by the departure of property owners and the cessation of commercial activity. For the households of the poor who neither fled nor recovered quickly, the economic aftermath of a cholera epidemic stretched well beyond the weeks of the outbreak itself, since the loss of a primary earner to cholera's mortality, which had come within hours of the first symptoms in the most severe cases, created exactly the sequence of household financial collapse that the ordinary non-epidemic years produce one household at a time, but now compressed into a single season and distributed across thousands of families at once. But the epidemic that demonstrated with the greatest completeness what a concentrated outbreak of infectious disease could do to the economic and social foundation of an American city was not cholera, but yellow fever, and arrived not in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, but along the inland river system of the Mississippi Valley in the summer and autumn of 1878, in what became the most consequential single epidemic disaster in the history of the continental United States. During this century, yellow fever had been a recurring presence in the port cities of the Gulf Coast for generations, appearing most years in New Orleans with enough regularity that the city had developed a partial cultural accommodation to its seasons, the departure of those who could afford to leave, the acceptance among those who remained that summer carried of particular fevers, and the observation, which contemporaries recorded without fully understanding it, that those who had survived one episode of yellow fever were somehow protected against subsequent ones, while newcomers to the city were far more vulnerable than those born and long settled there. The disease was caused by a virus transmitted by the bite of the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a biological mechanism that would not be identified until Walter Reed's commission established in Cuba in 1900. 22 years after the 1878 epidemic had run its full course without anyone understanding why the disease spread as it did or what practical measures beyond flight might have contained it. In late July of 1878, yellow fever was confirmed among passengers and crew of a vessel that had arrived at New Orleans from Havana, carrying a contagion that the city's weakened quarantine apparatus failed to intercept. Within weeks, the disease had moved northward along the river, appearing in Vicksburg, Mississippi, then in Memphis, Tennessee, then in towns and settlements throughout the river valley in progression that outpaced any quarantine system of the period. The governors of several states issued proclamations establishing shotgun quarantines, armed guards posted at roads and river crossings to prevent the movement of travelers from infected areas. But these measures were applied inconsistently and were routinely circumvented by those with sufficient urgency or resources to find alternative routes. Memphis in the summer of 1878 was a city of approximately 47,000 residents, built on a bluff above the Mississippi, commercially dependent on the river trade, and carrying into that summer a significant accumulated debt from municipal improvements of the previous decade that had left its public finances in a fragile condition before the epidemic added to its burdens. When yellow fever was confirmed in the city in early August, the response of those with the means and mobility to leave was immediate and nearly complete. Within 10 days of the first confirmed cases, approximately 25,000 people had fled the city by every available conveyance, steamboat, rail, wagon, and on foot, departing with whatever they could carry and leaving behind both the city's poorest residents and those whose employment or property obligations made departure impossible. Those who remained numbered approximately 19,000, including the great majority of the city's black residents, approximately 14,000 people, and a smaller number of white residents whose poverty or professional commitments had kept them in place. Among those who chose to remain were the physicians and nurses who had committed to their posts, the members of religious orders whose vows did not permit flight, and the volunteers of the Howard Association, a charitable organization that had maintained a presence in Memphis through earlier epidemic seasons, and whose members now undertook the organization of nursing care, food distribution, and the removal of the dead as the epidemic scale exceeded anything the city's remaining official capacity could manage. The dead accumulated at a rate that the city's ordinary burial infrastructure could not absorb. Kate Bionda, an Italian immigrant who operated a small establishment near the waterfront, is recorded among the first confirmed Memphis deaths in early August. Within weeks of mortality was claiming between 50 and 100 lives each day, and the city's remaining undertakers, grave diggers, and coffin makers were working through days and nights without adequate restoration before the following day's demands arrived. The Sisters of St. Francis, who had traveled from their mother house in Oldenburg, Indiana, to assist with nursing in Memphis, lost several of their members to the disease during the epidemic's worst weeks. The Sisters of St. Mary, an Episcopal religious order that had been working in Memphis for several years before the outbreak, continued their nursing under conditions that killed a number of their members. Their superior, known as Sister Constance, died of yellow fever in September of 1878, and was later recognized among what the Episcopal Church came to call the Martyrs of Memphis, a small group of clergy and religious who had remained at their posts and died in service to those they had been sent to care for. The aggregate mortality from yellow fever in Memphis in 1878 reached approximately 5,150 deaths, drawn from a population of those who had remained or been unable to leave. A mortality rate among those present in the city during the epidemic that exceeded one death for every 4 persons who had not fled. Across the broader Mississippi Valley, the epidemic killed an estimated 13,000 to 20,000 people in towns and settlements from Louisiana northward through Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas, with cases reaching as far north as Cincinnati, Ohio, and as far east as Nashville, Tennessee. The economic destruction accompanied the human mortality with a thoroughness that the commercial records of the affected region captured in partial but vivid terms. The cotton trade that sustained Memphis as a regional commercial center effectively ceased for the duration of the epidemic season. Merchants who had fled left their establishments unattended or with skeleton staff, and the goods and accounts that constituted their working capital sat immobile through months of the commercial calendar when they would ordinarily have been in active circulation. Credit from banks in St. Louis and New York, which had sustained the cotton factors and commission merchants through their ordinary seasonal cycles, dried up during the epidemic months as the creditors in question declined to extend further obligations to enterprises whose principals had either died or were managing from a distance under conditions of considerable uncertainty. The city of Memphis emerged from the 1878 epidemic in a state of financial collapse that was formalized in the following year when the Tennessee state legislature stripped the city of its municipal charter and replaced it with a taxing district administered by a commission with limited authority and no capacity to issue bonds. This outcome, the legal dissolution of a city's existence as a self-governing entity, produced by the combination of epidemic mortality, the flight of taxpayers, the cessation of commerce, and the accumulated costs of medical care, burial, and relief, was the most dramatic instance in the century's record of what epidemic disease could do to the institutional fabric of an American community, but was an extreme expression of consequences that appeared in less total form in the economic. Records of every city and town that a serious epidemic had visited, the patterns of who died during the Memphis epidemic, and in what proportion, illustrated the degree to which epidemic mortality followed the existing lines of social vulnerability rather than distributing itself impartially across a population. The observation that black residents of Memphis appeared to die of yellow fever in smaller proportions than white residents, approximately 700 to 1,000 deaths among the approximately 14,000 black residents who remained, compared to a far higher proportion mortality among the white residents who had stayed, was widely noted at the time and given interpretations that range from biological to ideological. The partial accuracy of an explanation rooted in acquired immunity. Populations with longer historical exposure to yellow fever in West and Central Africa had in some cases developed partial biological resistance over generations, was a legitimate observation that the science of the period lacked the tools to assess precisely, and it was an observation that contemporary commentators frequently bent toward arguments about racial constitution that the evidence did not support and that the history of American racial ideology suggests were shaped by prior commitments rather than by careful analysis of what the mortality data actually showed. Tuberculosis operated on a different temporal scale than cholera or yellow fever, lacking the sudden visible catastrophe of an epidemic season, and producing its mortality instead through a continuous presence that was woven into the texture of ordinary life throughout the century. The disease was the single largest cause of death in the United States from the beginning of the century through most of the 1890s, responsible in some years for approximately 1 in 7 of all deaths recorded in the country, and responsible across the century as a whole for a cumulative mortality that exceeded that of any single epidemic event by a substantial margin. Robert Koch's identification of Mycobacterium tuberculosis in Berlin in 1882 established the bacterial cause of the disease for the first time, displacing an understanding that had attributed consumption partly to hereditary constitution and partly to environmental conditions of cold, damp, and insufficient nutrition, none of which was an incorrect description of contributing vulnerability, even if none captured the necessary bacterial mechanism. The knowledge that consumption was a communicable disease, transmissible through the respiratory secretions of those carrying the organism, arrived at a moment when most American families had already experienced its presence within their own households, and the practical question of what to do with that knowledge under conditions of poverty, crowded housing, and an absence of any effective treatment remained without a satisfactory answer for decades after Koch's announcement had settled the biological question. What the epidemic diseases of the 19th century made visible, in their periodic concentrated form, was a social condition that was otherwise distributed quietly across the landscape of ordinary life. The cholera that killed 3,500 people in New York City in 1832, and the yellow fever that killed 5,100 in Memphis in 1878, and the tuberculosis that claimed 1 in 7 of those who died across the century, each produces mortality through the specific intersection of a biological agent and a social environment that had been shaped through decades of accumulated decisions and deliberate non-decisions in ways that concentrated the risk among those least equipped to bear it. The epidemic was not an interruption of the ordinary social costs of illness, but an intensification of them, a moment when the costs that individual households had been absorbing in isolation, one sick person at a time, arrived simultaneously, and at a scale that made the social architecture sustaining them impossible to overlook, even for those who, in ordinary years, found it entirely easy to look away. The family household in 19th century America was not simply a domestic arrangement of persons bound by affection and legal obligation. It was, in its essential economic structure, a small productive unit whose financial viability depended on the continuous labor of each able-bodied member in the precise role that the household's income model required. When illness removed the primary earner from that role, the disruption reached into every dimension of the household's practical life. The food purchased, the rent maintained, the debt serviced, in ways that no amount of domestic reorganization could fully address so long as the income generating that structure had ceased. The household did not suffer emotionally in isolation from its economic circumstances. The two forms of damage arrived simultaneously, compounded one another, and proceeded at a pace that the household's internal resources were in most cases entirely unable to match. The children within such a household occupied a position in this economic calculus that the period's moral vocabulary attempted to hold in tension with another set of values. The idea of childhood as a protected period of formation, of the child as a being whose education deserved precedence over immediate economic contribution. That tension found expression in a growing legislative movement through the century's middle and latter decades to regulate the ages at which children could be employed in factories and mines. But the economic pressure of a parent's illness resolved that tension in the working-class household with a directness that legislation found consistently difficult to reach, since a factory inspector who closed a mill to children under 12 could not supply the income the household had sent the child to earn. A textile operative in the mills of Fall River, Massachusetts, earning between $4 and $6 a week in the early 1880s, left behind. When illness took him from his loom for 3 or 4 weeks, a household whose income had been calibrated to his earnings and perhaps to the supplementary wages of a wife doing piecework at home. When the father's wages ceased and the family's margin disappeared, the calculation about whether the children might take positions in the mill entered a different register entirely, driven not only by the appetite of factory owners, though that appetite was real and consistent, but by the immediate arithmetic of a household facing eviction if the following week's rent could not be paid. The Massachusetts Bureau of Statistics of Labor, which conducted detailed surveys of child labor in the state's manufacturing establishments through the 1870s and early 1880s under the directorship of Henry Kemble Oliver, found children as young as 10 and 11 working regular hours alongside adult operatives in the cotton and woolen mills of Lowell, Fall River, and New Bedford. The testimony collected by the Bureau in its reports of 1875 and 1876 included accounts from children describing their working days with a plainness that their interviewers recorded without editorial comment. Rising before 5 in the morning, walking to the mill in winter darkness, working through shifts of 10 hours or more. Oliver reported that in a significant proportion of the cases where children had entered mill employment below what the Bureau regarded as an appropriate age, the precipitating event in the family's recent history had been the illness, death, or disabling injury of a parent, not a permanent economic arrangement reflecting established family practice, but a response to a specific crisis that had then extended, as such crises tended to do, well beyond its original occasion. The legal and economic position of women whose husbands fell seriously ill or died was defined through most of the century by a framework designed, in its essential structure, for a world in which the husband's continuous earning capacity could be assumed as the uninterrupted condition of family life. The common law doctrine of coverture, by which a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's upon marriage, leaving her without independent standing to contract, sue, hold property in her own name, or retain her own earnings, had been partially addressed by the Married Women's Property Acts that began with New York State in 1848 and spread through most of the northern states over the following 2 decades. These acts gave married women the right to hold property acquired before marriage and received by gift or inheritance during marriage without its becoming subject to the husband's debts or his management. But the legislation did not address the situation of the woman whose husband had been the household's primary earner and who became, through his incapacitating illness, both a nurse to a sick person and the sole adult responsible for generating an income in a labor market that offered women far fewer opportunities at far lower wages than those available to men. The woman whose husband had fallen ill with a chronic condition, the consumption that might persist for months or years, or the aftermath of a workplace accident, leaving a man physically capable of some limited activity, but not the sustained labor his previous employment required, was placed simultaneously in the roles of caregiver, income generator, and household manager, with no institutional structure available to acknowledge the compounded demands of that position, let alone to assist in bearing them. Grace Hoadley Dodge, whose work among the working women of New York City in the 1880s led to the establishment of working girls' clubs intended to provide education and social support to women in industrial employment, documented in her organizational reports the circumstances that had brought individual women to their present positions. A substantial proportion of the cases she examined contained a history that included the illness of a husband or father whose incapacity had compelled the woman to seek employment at whatever the immediate market offered rather than what training or preference might have suggested. The options available in most cities to a woman who needed immediate income without prior preparation were domestic service in a household willing to employ her, piecework in the needle trades or in the cigar rolling operations concentrated in the tenement districts, employment in the commercial laundries at service hotels and boarding houses, or factory work at wages that typically ran between 1/3 and 1/2 those paid to male operatives performing equivalent tasks. The partial and imperfect buffer that the Mutual Aid Society provided against these circumstances was, for households that had access to it, one of the most significant financial instruments available in an era that offered almost no others of comparable design. The Independent Order of Odd Fellows, which had established its first American lodge in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1819, and had grown by 1870 to a membership of approximately 455,000 men distributed across lodges in every region of the country, provided members with a weekly sick benefit, typically between $3 and $5 per week, during periods of documented illness, funded through regular member dues and supplemental assessments. When the lodge's sick fund required additional support, the Knights of Pythias, founded in Washington in 1864 by the government clerk Justice Henry Rathbone and organized on explicit principles of friendship, charity, and benevolence, offered comparable benefits through its subordinate lodges and had grown by 1880 to a membership of several 100,000 across the country. The ancient order of foresters, the Royal Arcanum, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, and a constellation of smaller fraternal organizations each maintained some version of a mutual aid fund. drawing on the economic logic of shared risk and the social logic of membership obligation that made a claim on lodge funds something different in moral texture from the experience of applying to a charitable organization that assessed the recipient's worthiness before extending whatever assistance it could offer. The ethnic mutual aid societies that immigrant communities organize alongside or in parallel with the English language fraternal orders served populations whose language, cultural background, and specific economic circumstances shaped the design of what they offered. The German Benevolent Society of New York, which had maintained operations since the early decades of the century, provided assistance to German immigrants in conditions of medical or financial distress, and connected them to the network of German-speaking physicians and apothecaries whose services were calibrated to their community's particular needs. The Irish Emigrant Society maintained similar functions for the Irish communities of the northeastern cities, operating from offices that served as a first point of contact for new arrivals seeking employment, accommodation, and when illness arrived, whatever society's resources permitted it to extend. The Hebrew Benevolent Society of New York served the city's Jewish population with charitable assistance that included support for those left destitute by illness or by the death of an earning member. By the 1880s and 1890s, the newer immigrant communities arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italian, Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, had begun establishing their own benefit societies organized along village, regional, or national lines. And these organizations were in many cases the first institution a recently arrived immigrant could reach when illness arrived before any other support structure had taken root around him. The Knights of Labor, which had organized in Philadelphia in 1869 under the initial leadership of Uriah Stevens and had grown by 1886 to a membership of approximately 700,000, maintained sick benefit funds through many of its local assemblies, funded by member assessments and intended to provide some replacement for wages during periods of incapacity. The coal miners organized under the Workingmen's Benevolent Association in the anthracite districts of Pennsylvania, and later under the United Mine Workers of America, similarly maintained sick benefit arrangements as a fundamental part of the membership proposition, reflecting both the particular physical dangers of underground labor and the recognition that mining produced, with regularity, the kind of respiratory illness and traumatic injury that could remove a man from productive work for extended periods. These labor organization benefit funds represented, for the working class household that received them, the only institutionalized protection against wage loss through illness that the 19th century American economy otherwise declined to provide, and their vulnerability to the financial pressures of strikes, lockouts, and membership fluctuation made them considerably less reliable than the purposes they were designed to serve. The commercial life insurance industry had identified the fear of exactly this vulnerability, the sudden cessation of earned income through death or disabling illness, as the emotional center of its product offering from its earliest years in America. The Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, chartered in 1842, and the New York Life Insurance Company, established in 1845, built their initial markets among the professional and merchant classes of the northeastern cities by framing life insurance as the instrument through which a responsible man fulfilled his obligation to protect his family against the financial consequences of his premature death. The marketing language of these companies addressed a husband and father in terms that engaged both his sense of duty and his recognition of a specific financial risk that the centuries' patterns of illness and mortality made concrete enough to feel immediate and not merely hypothetical. The expansion of life insurance to working-class households became the commercial project of the industrial insurance carriers that emerged in the latter decades of the century. The Prudential Insurance Company of America, established in Newark, New Jersey in 1875 by John Fairfield Dryden on the model of the British Prudential Insurance Company, and the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company of New York, which began its own industrial insurance operations in 1879, pursued this market by offering policies in small denominations, face values of between $50 and $300, sufficient to cover burial expenses and provide a modest sum beyond, with premiums collected weekly at the policyholder's home. An agent calling at the tenement door each week to collect a premium of between 5 and 15 cents made life insurance financially accessible to households without the margin for a quarterly or annual payment. And by the final decades of the century, Metropolitan Life's agents were making their rounds through the tenement districts of New York, Newark, Boston, and Philadelphia, with a regularity that made them as familiar a presence in those neighborhoods as the coal wagon or the rent collector. What the policyholder was purchasing, in most cases, was not an expectation of financial improvement, but simply the assurance that his family would not be left unable to bury him without incurring a debt that would compound the other debts his death was already certain to leave behind. The children who were left without parents by epidemic seasons, by consumption's long diminishment, or by the workplace accidents that the industrial economy produced without interruption moved through two principal channels, depending on the circumstances that survived their parents. Those with relatives willing and financially capable of absorbing them passed into informal kinship arrangements that the law barely acknowledged, and that left the child's welfare entirely dependent on the warmth and material resources of the receiving household. Those without such relatives, or those whose surviving parent had entered the almshouse or a hospital from which recovery seemed unlikely, came to the attention of the charitable organizations that had made provision, to whatever extent their funding allowed, for precisely this class of person. The New York Orphan Asylum, established in 1806 and relocated several times as the city's growth overtook each successive site, distinguished in its intake records between a full orphan who had lost both parents and a half-orphan who had lost one, the latter comprising, through the middle and latter decades of the century, a substantial proportion of its resident population. The half-orphan's presence in the institution reflected exactly the financial arithmetic already described. A surviving parent, most often a mother, had been left with children she could not support on the wages available to her, and had placed them in the institution for a period she described as temporary, intending to reclaim them when her circumstances improved. The records of the New York Orphan Asylum, and the parallel records of the Children's Aid Society organized by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, documented with dispiriting regularity how infrequently that intended improvement arrived, how the mother who had placed a child in temporary care found, at the end of 6 months or a year, that her wages had not risen, that a second illness had occurred, that the gap between what she earned and what it cost to maintain children in a household remained precisely what it had been at the time of the original placement. Jacob Riis, the Danish-born journalist whose 1890 work How the Other Half Lives brought the conditions of the New York tenements to a readership that had the comfort of distance from them, moved through the same charitable case records and the same institutional files in assembling his account, and what he found confirmed in specific and anecdotal form what the Labor Bureau statistical surveys had been recording in aggregate for 2 decades. Illness was not incidental to the poverty of the neighborhoods he documented. It was among its primary generators, arriving often enough and doing enough damage consistently enough that the circumstances of a significant portion of the households he described could be traced, through careful inquiry into recent history, to a fever that had kept a father from work for 5 weeks, or to a pregnancy complication that had left a mother unable to return to the factory floor, or to a winter respiratory illness in a child that had required a parent to remain home and had cost a household 2 weeks of wages at a moment when the margin against catastrophe was already functionally non-existent. The family, in the social architecture of 19th century America, absorbed this damage quietly and without formal acknowledgement of what the absorption required. It redistributed labor, sent children to mills it had hoped to keep them from, sent mothers to laundries at wages that would not have sustained a single adult person, except to the charity of neighbors, the assessments of mutual aid lodges, and ultimately the intervention of charitable organizations whose assistance carried its own costs in dignity and social standing. The social costs distributed through this process were real costs, paid in the currency of children's development foreclosed, women's health compromised, and households permanently diminished in their capacity to withstand the next disruption that would, with near certainty, arrive. They simply did not appear in any public ledger, and society that imposed them through its structural arrangements did not, for most of the century, find either the vocabulary or political will to examine what it built, or to ask who, precisely, was paying for it. The first sustained argument in American public life for treating the sanitary conditions of the population as a matter of governmental responsibility rather than individual circumstance arrived not from a physician, not from any legislative committee, but from a Boston cloth merchant and self-trained statistician named Lemuel Shattuck, whose 1850 report of the Sanitary Commission of Massachusetts represented both a comprehensive inventory of the state's public health conditions and detailed blueprint for addressing them through institutional structures that did not yet exist. Shattuck had spent the preceding 2 decades compiling vital statistics for the city of Boston and advocating for the systematic registration of births, marriages, and deaths as a precondition for any serious public health analysis, a reform that several European nations, most notably England following the establishment of the General Register Office in 1837 under William Farr, had accomplished, while American practice remained inconsistent at the state level and almost entirely absent at the federal level. The registration system Shattuck eventually helped establish in Massachusetts gave him the statistical foundation from which his 1850 report drew its most compelling arguments, that the diseases causing the highest mortality in the state's population were not random misfortunes distributed impartially by fate, but were concentrated in specific places, among specific populations, under specific conditions of housing, water supply, and occupational exposure that could be described, measured, and in principle addressed. The report's recommendations ran to approximately 50 specific proposals, including the establishment of a permanent state board of health with genuine administrative authority, the appointment of local board of health in every town and city, the systematic collection of vital statistics, the inspection of housing conditions in the tenement districts of Boston and the manufacturing cities of the Connecticut Valley, the regulation of nuisances, including slaughterhouses and improperly maintained privies, and the establishment of a regular reporting system for communicable diseases that would allow the state to detect outbreaks before they reached epidemic proportions. Shattuck did not limit his recommendations to the outdoor sanitary environment. He included proposals regarding the adulteration of food and drugs, the ventilation of schools and public buildings, and the health education of the general population, a scope that reflected his understanding that the conditions producing excess mortality extended into every institution and domestic space through which the population moved, and that a sanitary administration confined to street drainage and refused removal would miss the greater part of its actual subject. The Massachusetts legislature received the report, filed it, and took no steps toward implementing its principal recommendations for nearly 2 decades following its publication. The State Board of Health that Shattuck had proposed did not come into existence until 1869, when Massachusetts became the first state in the country to establish a board with genuine investigative and advisory authority. Louisiana had established a State Board of Health in 1855, primarily in response to recurring yellow fever threats advancing from the port of New Orleans, but that board authority was narrow and its continuity uncertain across the political disruptions of the following decade. The Massachusetts Board, operating from 1869 under the initial leadership of Henry Ingersoll Bowditch, the distinguished Boston physician who had spent his career investigating pulmonary disease and who brought to his administrative work the systematic habits he had applied to his clinical investigations, represented the first serious effort in American governance to treat the ongoing sanitary condition of the population as a matter requiring permanent institutional attention, rather than periodic emergency response. Between Shattuck's report and the Massachusetts Board's establishment, the Civil War had intervened in ways that shaped the public health thinking of the following decades in concrete and lasting terms. The United States Sanitary Commission, organized in 1861 under the leadership of Frederick Law Olmsted as General Secretary, the same Olmsted whose design of Central Park had demonstrated that organized intention applied to urban space could improve the physical conditions of large populations, demonstrated during the war that systematic attention to the sanitary conditions of military encampments and to the organization of medical supply could produce measurable reductions in disease mortality under conditions of active operations. The Commission's published reports and its accumulated administrative experience generated a cohort of physicians and administrators whose engagement with organized large-scale sanitary management had given them a practical vocabulary for arguing, in the post-war years, that similar approaches applied to civilian urban conditions might produce similar results. The Commission's statistical records, which documented mortality from disease in Union camps before and after the application of sanitary reforms with a precision that had never previously been achieved in military medicine, constitute a body of evidence that public health advocates in the following decades cited with some regularity as proof of principle. The New York Metropolitan Board of Health, established by the New York State Legislature in March of 1866, represented the most consequential application of this post-war sanitary thinking to a specific an urgent urban situation. The years preceding its establishment had produced both the epidemiological evidence and the political circumstances that made legislation possible. The cholera threat building in Europe through 1865 provided the urgency, and the political report prepared by Stephen Smith and his colleagues in the Council of Hygiene of the Citizens Association of New York, published in 1865 following an exhaustive district-by-district inspection of the city's sanitary conditions, had provided the specific documented case for action. Smith's report described the tenement districts with precision that previous surveys had not achieved. The exact dimensions of the yards and courts in which privies served dozens of households, the proximity of privies to the wells from which those same households drew their drinking water, the occupancy levels of specific buildings, and the specific streets where drainage had failed entirely. The accumulated weight of this documentation made it considerably more difficult for legislators to sustain the position that the city's mortality rates were the natural and unalterable consequence of poverty, rather than a correctable product of specific physical conditions that policy could address. The Metropolitan Board of Health demonstrated its practical value almost immediately in its response to the 1866 cholera outbreak, intercepting an epidemic that the previous decade's improvements in transatlantic ship communication had made it possible to anticipate before it arrived on American shores. The board's capacity to identify contaminated water sources, to impose isolation on confirmed cases, to organize the distribution of disinfectants in the affected wards, and to coordinate the work of inspectors across the city's wards contributed substantially to the 1866 epidemic's far lower mortality relative to the outbreaks of 1832 and 1849. The board's success established a model that other major cities began to adapt across the following decade. Chicago's Board of Health was reorganized and strengthened to the late 1860s. The American Public Health Association, founded in 1872 through the efforts of, among others, Stephen Smith and John Shaw Billings of the Army Medical Corps, provided a national forum through which public health administrators could share methods, publish findings in the association's transactions, and develop a professional identity of field in the process of defining itself as distinct from medical practice and deserving of its own administrative structures, its own literature, and its own body of trained practitioners. The Marine Hospital Service, which had operated since 1798, to provide medical care to merchant seamen at port facilities along the American coastline, was reorganized and given an expanding role in quarantine enforcement at American ports through legislation in 1870 and 1879. John Maynard Woodworth, appointed supervising surgeon general of the service in 1871, introduced competitive examinations for admission to its medical corps and organized its personnel into a professional body whose training and discipline distinguished it from the more informal arrangements that had characterized the service in earlier years. The reorganized Marine Hospital Service became, in the following decades, the institutional foundation on which the Public Health Service would eventually be constructed, and its experience with quarantine operations during the yellow fever epidemic of 1878, when its officers were deployed to Gulf Coast and Mississippi Valley ports as the epidemic advanced northward, provided the institutional experience that informed subsequent federal thinking about epidemic control as a matter of national rather than purely local administrative responsibility. What transformed this emerging institutional infrastructure from a system organized around the containment of environmental nuisances into something capable of engaging disease at its biological origins was the arrival in American medical culture through the 1880s of the germ theory that Louis Pasteur had been developing in France since the early 1860s, and that Robert Koch's laboratory work in Berlin had made, by the early part of that decade, essentially impossible to resist on evidential grounds. Koch's identification of the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882, followed by his identification of the cholera vibrio in 1883 during a field investigation in Egypt and India, and his concurrent development of the technical methods, the solid culture media prepared from beef gelatin, the aniline staining techniques that made bacteria visible under the microscope with a clarity previously unattainable, the systematic isolation procedures that allowed a specific organism to be grown in pure culture and its properties studied without interference from other organisms, provided a conceptual and technical foundation on which a new American bacteriology could be constructed. The practical tools Koch had developed were teachable, and they were learned. William Henry Welch, who had trained in Leipzig and in Breslau, and had spent time in Koch's Berlin laboratory, absorbing both the technical methods and the intellectual orientation that governed their use, established a pathological laboratory at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in 1889, and became the most influential single figure in establishing the laboratory sciences as a foundation of American medical education. The generation of physicians Welch trained at Hopkins, and those trained at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and at Harvard Medical School, as these institutions reorganized their curricula around laboratory science through the 1880s and 1890s, carried into practice a conception of disease that was fundamentally different from anything their predecessors had worked with, specific organisms identifiable by specific methods, causing specific diseases through specific mechanisms, and susceptible in principle to specific interventions whose efficacy could be measured and compared. The distance between this model and the heroic medicine of Benjamin Rush was not merely one of technique, but of ontology, a different understanding of what disease was, and therefore what the physician's task in addressing it could possibly mean. The practical application of bacteriological knowledge to public health administration found its most developed expression in the work of Hermann Biggs, who became the chief medical inspector of the bacteriological laboratory of the New York City Department of Health in 1892, and who applied Koch's methods with a systematic and administrative intelligence that transformed them from research instruments into tools of public policy. Biggs organized the first public health bacteriology laboratory in the United States within the City Health Department, and his systematic approach to tuberculosis, including the collection of sputum samples from suspected cases, the laboratory confirmation of the diagnosis, and the mandatory reporting of confirmed cases to the health department, represented a genuinely new model of public health practice in which the laboratory served not as an instrument of knowledge alone, but as an instrument of administrative action. The diphtheria antitoxin program that the New York City Department of Health introduced in 1894, providing free bacteriological diagnosis and free antitoxin to physicians treating diphtheria cases throughout the city, demonstrated in quantifiable terms that the translation of bacteriological knowledge into a public health intervention could reduce mortality at a scale that individual clinical practice could never achieve, and that a health department organized around laboratory science could do things that the earlier generation of sanitary reformers had never imagined its institutional counterpart capable of doing. Running through this period of accelerating scientific and administrative development was a parallel transformation in the physical infrastructure of the major cities that contributed to the declining mortality rates that vital statistics were recording by the final decades of the century. The construction of filtered and chemically treated municipal water supply systems replaced the river intakes and contaminated wells that had sustained typhoid and cholera for generations, and the installation of comprehensive sewage collection and disposal systems in the larger cities. The work of sanitary engineers, including George E. Waring Jr., who reorganized New York City's street cleaning operations in the 1890s and introduced systematic sewer flushing as a preventive measure, changed the physical conditions in which epidemic disease had previously found its most reliable conditions for rapid spread. The mortality from typhoid fever in Massachusetts fell from approximately 42 deaths per 100,000 population in 1865 to approximately 22 per 100,000 by 1895, a reduction that public health investigators attributed in substantial proportion to improvements in the water supply of the state cities. The tenement house investigations that reformers conducted in New York City through the 1870s and 1880s provided the urban planning dimension of this reform moment. The statistical relationship between overcrowded and inadequately ventilated housing and tuberculosis mortality was well enough established by the 1880s that it could be presented in quantitative terms to health board administrators and legislative committees without requiring a sophisticated scientific vocabulary to evaluate. Lawrence Vailor, whose work as secretary of the charity organization Society's Tenement House Committee, produced the 1899 Tenement House exhibition at the Sherry Hotel in New York City, a display of maps, photographs, and statistical charts documenting tenement conditions in precise geographical detail, translated this accumulated documentation into a form of public argument that eventually produced the New York Tenement House Act of 1901, establishing minimum standards for light, ventilation, sanitation, and fire safety that applied to new construction throughout the city and representing the first comprehensive tenement regulation in American history. What had genuinely changed by 1900 constituted a different social landscape from what had existed at the century's opening, and the changes were real enough that the populations living through them experienced their effects in terms of reduced mortality from the diseases that had most reliably claimed lives in the earlier period. The germ theory had reorganized the scientific foundations of medicine, and the medical schools rebuilding themselves around the laboratory sciences were producing graduates whose understanding of disease bore little resemblance to anything proprietary schools of the 1840s had offered their students. Bacteriological laboratories were operating within the health departments of the major cities. Mortality rates from the acute epidemic diseases, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, had declined substantially to the final decades of the century, driven by improvements in water supply, sewage infrastructure, and the more organized public health responses that the better capitalized city health boards were now capable of mounting. And yet the structural assumption that had organized every relationship between the sick person and every institution the century had built around that person remained, at the century's close, essentially intact in its essential character. The sick working class person of 1899 navigated the same sequence of exhausted wages, accumulated debt, pawned possessions, charitable application, and institutional care that the sick working class person of 1830 had navigated, because not one element of the legal or economic framework that produced that sequence had been altered. No employer was legally required to compensate any worker for wages lost to illness. No government at any level had established payments to sustain households during periods of incapacity. The almshouse still received those for whom every other arrangement had failed. The charity hospital still filled its wards with patients whose poverty was a precondition of their admission and whose bodies remained. However, the vocabulary of medicine had been transformed by bacteriology, the material through which medical education conducted its essential work. The reformers who built the sanitary movement, the bacteriological laboratories, the nursing schools, and the tenement regulations had accomplished real and consequential things against real and organized resistance, and those accomplishments mattered in the most concrete possible terms for the populations they reached. But the frame within which every reform had been conducted, the frame that asked how the conditions of the poor might be improved sufficiently to reduce the burden they placed on the city's mortality statistics, on the resources of its charitable organizations, and on the commercial life of its streets during epidemic seasons, was not the frame that would have asked who was accumulating the financial benefit of treating illness as a private cost, or whose interests were being protected by a social architecture that distributed the cost of sickness with precision that followed the existing lines of poverty and race as reliably as any of the organisms Koch's laboratory had identified followed the lines of contaminated water and insufficient air. The century closed with that question still unformulated in any forum, where formulated it might have led to an answer requiring a genuine redistribution of what illness cost and who paid for it. The administrative vocabulary of public health had been substantially enlarged. The moral and political vocabulary capable of naming what that enlargement had left untouched had not yet found the institutional form or the political constituency that would be needed to use it. The 19th century closed with its most fundamental patterns of illness and financial ruin largely intact in their essential structure, even as the scientific understanding of disease had been transformed beyond anything a physician practicing at the century's opening could have anticipated or imagined. The germ theory had given medicine its modern foundations. Bacteriological laboratories had been built into the administrative apparatus of the larger city health departments, and mortality from the acute epidemic diseases that had periodically devastated American communities showed genuine and measurable improvement in the vital statistics of the closing decades. These were real achievements, built by real people: Lemuel Shattuck, Stephen Smith, Henry Bowditch, Hermann Biggs, William Henry Welch, Linda Richards, Lawrence Vailor, against the consistent pressure of indifference, competing commercial interests, and an institutional inertia that every reform movement of every era must contend with in some form. What had not changed was the relationship between sickness and financial ruin for those without private reserves sufficient to absorb a serious illness. The textile operative in Fall River and the coal miner in the anthracite districts of Pennsylvania and the sharecropper in the former Confederate states each entered the final years of the century in possession of the same fundamental exposure to catastrophic loss that had characterized the condition of their working counterparts at the century's beginning. No wage replacement existed. No government disability payment existed. The employer who had benefited from a worker's labor through decades of continuous service had no legal obligation to contribute anything to that worker's maintenance during the period of illness that decades of such labor might eventually produce. The history of illness in 19th century America is, at its core, the history of society that found every dimension of disease worth examining. Its biology, its geography, its seasonality, its statistical patterns, its relationship to sanitary conditions and overcrowded housing, except the question of who bore its costs and whether that distribution was either just or inevitable. That question was left without a satisfying answer for the century that followed. The door of the 19th century closed, as most doors do, not with a resolution but with particular quietness of deferred work and unfinished accounting, the long kind that takes generations to settle. Writing this script was one of those experiences where the research keeps pulling you deeper than you expected when you first sat down with a topic. I went in thinking I understood the broad outlines: no health insurance, unreliable medicine, difficult conditions. And what I found was that those outlines dramatically undersell how total the exposure was. Every single institution a sick person encountered in this period was either indifferent to their financial survival or actively built around the assumption that sickness was their own problem to solve. That finding shapes the entire script, and I think it gives it a coherence that the topic genuinely earns rather than one that was imposed on editorially. What I feel most satisfied with is the analytical thread running through every section, the idea that illness was treated as a private economic event first and a medical situation second. I did not have to force that connection. It was there in the historical record at every turn, from the physician's visit that cost 2 weeks of savings, through the charity hospital ward that required poverty as the precondition of admission, through the epidemic that dissolved Memphis as a legally constituted city. The best analytical threads are the ones you find inside the material, rather than the ones you bring to it. And this one was genuinely inside it. The epidemic section is where I feel the script does its strongest work. The Memphis yellow fever disaster of 1878 has exactly the kind of historical specificity, the named individuals, the daily mortality counts, the 25,000 residents who fled within 10 days, the legal dissolution of the city itself. That makes abstract arguments about the relationship between epidemic disease and economic destruction suddenly inhabit a real place and a real season. Sister Constance and the other martyrs of Memphis, the Howard Association volunteers, the competing mortality figures across racial lines. These details do genuine intellectual work rather than decorative work, which is a distinction that matters most in this kind of history, where the script is harder going, and I think honesty here is more useful than reassurance, is in the sections dealing with financial mechanics and administrative history. The middle stretch of Section 2 and part of Section 6, where the argument requires sustained attention to structures rather than to events or people. That material is essential to everything else the script argues, and I would not cut it. But I am aware that it earns its place through necessity rather than through immediate appeal to a listener drifting toward sleep. What stays with me most, having spent the time this script required with the source material, is something fairly simple. These were not remote or ancient conditions. The world described here, no sick pay, no disability, no meaningful public health infrastructure in most of the country, a medical profession organized around commercial transaction, is not separated from the present by any comfortable distance of historical time. The structural questions of the 19th century declined to answer were carried forward, and some of them are recognizable in forms not entirely transformed. History at this kind of proximity doesn't offer the reassurance of distance. It offers something more useful, the specific record decisions made and not made, and of what those decisions built one household at a time. That is what this script means to me. And if your own reading of this history takes you somewhere I have not gone, the comments are exactly the right place to say so.